Hello folks, I just wanted to give you a really quick update on kind of where we stand and where we are right now. When the sun went down on March the 25th in Jerusalem, they did see the new moon, and the barley was aviv, which means green ripe. And when that is the condition at the end of the 12th month, that's the end of the old year and the beginning of the new year. So we actually had Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, according to God's reckoning of the calendar. Rosh Hashanah began on March the 25th at sundown. And so we're in a new year now. We're in the month of Aviv. That's the first month of the Hebrew year. And it's a very, very active and busy month. In this month, first you have Rosh Hashanah, which is the head of the year. And they did have a little celebration of the new year, just like anybody does. And also in this month, on the 14th of the month of Aviv, every single year, you have Passover. And then the very next day begins the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a week-long festival or feast, and during which, as we talked about last year, the Feast of Unleavened Bread actually means that you remove the leaven out of your house. You don't eat any leavened bread, which is bread that is soft and fluffy and kind of sweet tasting. Unleavened bread is a little more like a cracker. But it was basically symbolic for the idea that you remove the leaven from your entire life. It's like a spring cleaning or a spring restoration time. So when you remove the leaven from your life, you get rid of those jelly donuts that you're eating for breakfast and go back to eating a healthy breakfast. You get back into the gym. You get rid of the clutter out of your house. You clean up your yard. You know, it was the spring restoration time. They were getting ready for harvest and a long harvest season in the spring. So anyway, this year, everything went as planned. If you'll recall, last year we had an Adar Bet, which means at the end of the 12th month, the barley was not aviv, even though they did see the new moon, and therefore we had to add a 13th month, and it reset our calendar. So naturally this year the barley was aviv. We're reset and ready to go for another 3 or 4 years now before we have to have another Adar Bet and add a 13th month. Now, if you'll recall, last year we had an odd sort of convergence in which Passover actually fell on Easter Sunday. That won't happen very often, and it certainly won't happen this year. But this year, the Passover is going to fall on basically at sundown on April the 7th will be the beginning of Passover. And then the very next day, the Feast of Unleavened Bread begins, and we start removing the leaven from our lives. And then the very first day of the next week is always the day of first fruits. In other words, the first day of the week after the Passover is always the day of first fruits. And this year, if you want to celebrate something that is valid and biblical and truly Christian on Easter Sunday, which is not Christian, it's pagan, but if you want to celebrate something that is actually Christian on Easter Sunday, celebrate the day of first fruits and plan to give a tithe or a tenth or some portion to some faith-based organization. If you want to give to Worldwide Israel United, that's fine. Though we're not a ministry, we're certainly a nonprofit faith-based organization, and that works too. Just, it's a day of first fruits. What they did back in the day was they gave their first week's worth of harvest. All of it went to their first fruits offering. Now, let's talk about the history of Passover. The very first foreshadowing of the Passover that has become a part of our lives as Israelites and people of Israel, the very first foreshadowing was when Abraham, this is hundreds of years before Moses, way, way back. Abram is what he was. He wasn't even called Abraham yet because God hadn't renamed him Abraham. And Abram, after Sodom was attacked by multiple armies of thousands of soldiers and sacked, and prisoners were taken and spoil was taken, and the armies headed back toward their homeland, Abram and 120 of his servants went forth, tracked those armies down, defeated those armies, and took back the spoil, and rescued Lot and his family and all the other prisoners from Sodom. This is even before Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, folks. This is way, way back. So he brought back the spoil. He brought back all the prisoners back to Sodom. And that is, in the Bible, you will see the very first tithe offered to God. Because of that spoil, Abram offered 10% or gave 10% of the spoil to the God of heaven and earth. And so that was the first recorded tithe in the Bible. And after he did that, the high priest Melchizedek, who in hindsight in our biblical studies we know Melchizedek actually became Jesus. I mean, Melchizedek is God in the flesh. Melchizedek is our high priest, whereas Moses and the Levitical priest had a priesthood that was based on the Levitical priesthood. Melchizedek was our high priest before the Levitical priesthood was ever formed. Melchizedek, as described in the Bible, actually is a manifestation of the physical presence of God. But he brought forth not roasted lamb and bitter herbs and the blood of the lamb like we did for many years and like the Jews still sort of celebrate the Passover. No, in his great and long-reaching foresight, Melchizedek brought forth bread and wine because he knew that someday in the far future, his elect would not celebrate the Passover with bitter herbs and a roasted lamb and the blood of the lamb. They would celebrate the Passover by taking communion with wine and bread. So Melchizedek had extreme foresight in bringing forth wine and bread, but it celebrated the fact that he had brought them through this amazing battle unscathed. In other words, the death angel or death and destruction had passed over them. Okay, that was the first very foreshadowing, very early on, of the Passover celebration. The very first actual event that designated the Passover was, of course, in Egypt. And, of course, the whole ritual was dripping with messianic symbolism because they took the blood of the lamb and put it over the doorpost. They went inside, they ate roasted lamb, and the same lamb whose blood was on the doorpost. And they ate bitter herbs, and they had their staves in their hands and their shoes on their feet because they were ready to roll and rock and roll. God had said, do this and I'm going to deliver you out of Egypt, so be ready to go. And also the Bible says God healed them all because when they left it said there was not a feeble one in their midst. So when you see Cecil B. DeMille and see blind people and lame people and crippled people being helped along and this big throng of people going out of Egypt, that is historically incorrect. God healed all the Israelites. There were no feeble people. There were no blind people, no lame people, nobody that had any infirmity went out of Egypt. And also, they didn't go out in a big, huge throng. If you will read the Bible carefully, you will see that they marched out of Egypt in groups of 5, and I think it was columns of 5. In other words, a column 5, 5, 5, and so that's 25 people to a column. Because if they did it that way, they could have started marching in the morning, and by 3 in the afternoon, they'd have all been out of Egypt. There were like 2 million people that had to exodus out of Egypt. But they didn't just go out in a throng, and there were no lame and blind and poor, and they took as much spoil as they want, which is much wealth. They took herds, they took flocks. They took a lot with them when they went, and they went out in groups of 5s, I think columns of 25, 5 columns of 25, and they marched out in a very orderly fashion as opposed to the way Cecil B. DeMille shows it in the Ten Commandments. Okay, that was our second little example of a Passover, and that was like the original event that is always remembered and memorialized on the Passover. And very shortly after that, they crossed the Red Sea. And that is considered a type of the Passover as well, because all of the righteous people, all of the Israelites, made it across unscathed. Pharaoh and his armies go charging down between those columns of water. And none of them escaped, not even Pharaoh, even though in the Ten Commandments, Cecil B. DeMille shows that Yul Brynner, the Pharaoh of the time, survived that flood. No, the true Pharaoh at the time did not. Pharaoh's chariot is at the bottom of the Red Sea to this day. But anyway, that was actually about the third example of a Passover. And then, as far as biblically, we go another 1,500, 1,450 years, and we come to the actual event that all of the Passover symbology and all of the Passover celebrations were all about. It was the genuine, real, only actual Passover, the ultimate Passover that occurred. And that was when Jesus was crucified. The first night of the Passover, that Wednesday night, Jesus was already in the grave. And so he was Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday, and then he arose before sundown on Saturday. If you will do your counting on your fingers or with your abacus or with whatever you have to count with, you will realize that that is an actual 3 days and 3 nights in the grave. From Friday, Good Friday, folks, to Easter Sunday morning, you've only got 2 nights no matter how you slice it. And you have to fudge to make it 3 days. You have to, well, he was in the grave for, an hour, so we're going to call that 1 day. No, he was not crucified on Friday. He did not rise on Sunday morning. He was crucified on Wednesday. He was in the grave Wednesday night. He was in the grave Thursday. He was in the grave Thursday night, Friday night, and Saturday. That's 3 days and 3 nights, and he rose before sundown on Saturday. That is the true monumental event. That was all the world's ultimate Passover, because Jesus' blood paid the price for the sins of mankind, the mortal sins of mankind. And that is the Passover, and that's what the Passover is all about. Easter is named after a pagan goddess named Ishtar and has absolutely nothing to do with Christianity. Okay, folks, those are the Passovers, and there is one more foreshadowing of a Passover. When we celebrate Passover, now it's a memorial of the great Passover of Jesus being crucified, sacrificing his life, the lamb slain from the foundation of the world. And that is what we memorialize with the Passover. But the Passover is still foreshadowing one last event, and that event is when the elect gather in heaven with Jesus, with the King of Kings, the Christ, in the heavenly dimension on the sea of fire and glass. And it's all the elect and Jesus, and we're basically partying and celebrating the end of the age and the beginning of the kingdom of God here on earth. And at that point, our Passover is fully complete. We have passed through the fire, we have survived and passed through the mortal journey that all of us angelic beings are now on. We're on a temporary mortal journey here. But in the kingdom, in the last celebration on the sea of fire and glass, everything will have passed over us, and we will be ready to live an immortal life eternally in the presence of Christ. And so what we are foreshadowing with the Passover is that last great wonderful day when everything is completed, everything is finished, and the death, the lake of fire, it will have passed over us. We will have not been part of that last little small multitude of incorrigibles, the worst of the worst, that will actually end up in the lake of fire. Everybody else, folks, is going to make it. We're going to make it to the kingdom, and we will be in that celebration on the sea of fire and glass. And that will be the most amazing celebration anybody has ever experienced, and that will be the final little type and symbol of the ultimate Passover. We will have passed through it all, and everything will have passed over, and we will be ready then to continue and complete our eternal, immortal life in the presence of God. And if you think that's going to be boring and that it's going to be so long that it will become boring and tedious, you have no idea what God has planned for us after the kingdom is established. I can tell you, my friends, it's beyond our imagination right now. A mortal man can't even imagine. Once we have all passed through this mortal journey, corrected ourselves because we screwed up so bad in the first stage, now we're correcting ourselves and we will go forward, and that will be the final little type of the Passover. So anyway, folks, that's the history of the Passover and the future of the Passover. Enjoy the Passover. When Easter Sunday comes, remember that it's the day of first fruits. That's when you're supposed to offer up something based on your faith, whatever you think Christianity and God and all your blessings are worth to you. You should make some symbolic donation or contribution or sacrifice to wherever your faith comes from. And if that ends up being Worldwide Israel, more power to us, and that's great. And okay, I'm going to conclude this tape right here. Thanks everyone for watching. God bless all the watchmen and all they watch, and we will see you next time.